Hello, everyone. So it's February 15th, and this is the infrastructure AMA around cells. Cameron, you have the first two questions. Do you want to verbalize?
Sure. So the first question that I had was, how uniform do you expect cells to be in size and capacity? Part of this comes up with just the general concern that as we add more and more cells, how uniform will they be? How will we size, how will we deal with like resource overruns or resource shortfalls? We currently already have this problem in GitLab. And are we just going to have statically sized cells that, we're constantly moving organizations between cells or something like we do with GitLab?
Yeah, so the migration part, like moving organizations from one cell to another, is still something that's being worked on, and it's not going to be something that we're going to do in Cell 1.0. So right now they're going to be static sizes, and like I would expect us to see at the beginning some uniformity in the sense, like for example, let's say we go with the 3K reference architecture for cells, and then maybe cell 4 and 5 will go with the 10K reference architecture. And the reason for this is right now with cells 1.0, at least we're going to be selective with the customers we put on, right? Like this is going to be not like there's are some product limitations on cell 1.0. So it's going to be an agreement with the customer that, hey, they're signing up for these limitations. And it's something that we gonna, why not, I don't want to call this like this, but like white glove on board them, like make sure we have the right infrastructure for them and like the correct sizing for them. And then the more learnings we get, the more better understanding of what the correct size is and how much overhead we need to have and things like that. So it would be similar to how we're doing it in Italy at the moment.
Do you think that we'll have the capability to tell a customer that we will not grow the cell to meet their needs?
I don't think we'll have the capability.
Okay.
I mean, if we want to, if the customer is growing, I don't think we want to tell them no.
Right.
So yeah.
I just like, I am trying to envision like, how many, like, if we pattern them and we keep them all the same size and we have lots of different like reference, like kind of like, I'm going to use t-shirt sizes for different types of use.
Yep.
That helps, but if it's easier to resize than it is to migrate, we will end up with kind of breaking our t-shirt size pattern, and we'll just end up with every cell is a uniquely sized thing versus if we focus on like migration tooling sooner, that could fix it. Anyway, we don't have to get down those details. I'm just trying to figure out like where that is headed and whether we should raise the concern more for uniformity versus better tooling and that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, migration is top of mind. It's just we need to pick something to work on first, and we're not going to work on migration just because we don't have any cells yet to migrate to, right? So we're going to first focus on provisioning the cells and setting up some cells and having some customers on those cells, and then we'll look into the migration stuff as well. I mean, we're depending on migrations for cell 1.5 as well, like migrating some users from GitLab.com to cells. So migration tooling is something that's going to come up after we're running cell 1.0 in production.
I also think that, like maybe this is somewhat a little bit kind of came out of my second question, and I'm just going to ask this as like a follow-on to this because it deals with the sizing is when this is maybe just my perspective, when I think of GitLab.com as like a prototype of a instance or a cell, it feels very large. And when I think of a dedicated instance, it feels very small. And so when we talk about like kind of, I'm going to use that term again, like these t-shirt sizes of cell instantiations, how big do we think that they are realistically going to be? Are they going to be on par with like a GitLab.com size each cell, or
No.
because dedicated feels like it's just a very small number of pods and like it's almost like an on-prem. Are we thinking that size, or is it somewhere in the middle?
We're thinking more dedicated size. So I think right now, at least, following our reference architecture, it's like the biggest size it offers is 50,000, right? 50,000 users. Now, I'm not saying that we're gonna always go with 50,000. We can create new reference architectures because we find it more cost effective running 100,000, for example.
Right.
But we're more thinking a smaller subset. And the reason for this is because we end up hitting less scalability issues, like with the database, with Redis, like, for example, maybe Redis cluster becomes out of question because we're never going to hit the limits of a single Redis instance, for example, right? So we're much like the way the benefit of cells is we can run smaller GitLabs and horizontally scale them. Now, the
Right.
question comes in, what's the biggest cell can be? That depends on our biggest customer on GitLab.com and what shape or form they can fit in,
So
and what t-shirt size they can fit.
it sounds like from that answer that we, and I don't want to say this is like a hard and fast rule, but that we would have one organization per cell roughly. I know that that isn't a hard reference,
No.
but I know that we wouldn't have like
more
like multiple organizations
per
per.
cell.
So that tells me it sounds bigger than dedicated. Like we would need more resources.
I mean, by 3,000 users, we're talking about concurrent users, right? So
Okay.
3,000 concurrent users is more than just one organization.
But we're not planning to do the reverse. We wouldn't have a single organization spread across multiple cells. Like that's not feasibility.
Physically
That's
not
not
possible.
Perfect.
Yeah. We're sharding by the organization ID. So
right.
The organization has to live in a single cell.
And then my next question was, this came up in some of our discussions about how we could start to bootstrap learning in the ops team and maybe for other teams. Is there something tangible that can be set up or instantiated today that could help us start, working with a cell? And I'm going to go by the answer I see so far. It doesn't sound like that's really feasible today.
I mean, if you want to start learning today, you can start learning on onboarding on GitLab dedicated, because we're gonna, like, at the moment, work is being done to port GitLab dedicated on GCP. But the fundamental stuff, like what AMP is, what instrumenter is, what get is, like how that stuff is gonna work, it's still gonna be the same. So if you want to start learning something today, start looking into GitLab dedicated, the documentation and the onboarding as well. And I think as far as I'm aware, the foundation team is already going through that process, and the delivery already went through that process 6 months ago or so. So yeah. Does that answer your question, Cameron?
Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you.
Steve, you have the next question.
Yeah, so and I see your answers here, so I might rephrase part of mine slightly. But for cells 1.0, if I understand correctly, we'll have one customer cell. And so we have various blueprints being drawn up for how various aspects of the cells will work and how they'll look. So my question is, like, do we expect the first cell to look anything like GitLab.com, and or will it look more like a dedicated on GCP instance? And I think, like, when I say that, I know that we're going to be using the dedicated tooling, but I'm thinking more like what the tooling creates. Will it be different than just this standard reference architecture that we've kind of already got set up? And so I think, yeah, like the one part I've struggled with is understanding if or when we need to kind of shift and kind of push our existing architecture into that dedicated tooling to look more like GitLab.com. or if that only matters later on or at all. Yeah.
To answer the first part, it's like with cells 1.0, at least the target is to have uh, 10 cells.
Yeah, it's up to 10.
Up to 10. Sorry, I was trying to type and say words at the same time. Not a good idea. Now, you mentioned if the architecture is going to look like more like GitLab.com or dedicated. My last point number E, Scarbeck started working on what we're calling the dedicated diff. So what's the difference between GitLab.com right now and dedicated? And a few examples is GitLab.com runs in decomposition mode, meaning there's a main database and the CI database. Are we going to do that? Dedicated does not support that at the moment, which is the best option. The registry, for example, the registry on GitLab.com runs Postgres for online garbage collection. Dedicated does not. What are we going to do? And so on and so forth. I think in the beginning, at least, it's going to look more like dedicated than GitLab.com. And the reason for this is GitLab.com has some really complex deployments like Redis cluster, Patroni, all that stuff, right? And we might not need that complexity for dedicated since they're running much smaller GitLab instances. So I think it's something like, I think the GitLab dedicated diff would be really helpful for us to understand what actually the difference is and do we need that or not? Like, for example, another example is HA proxy. We won't have HA proxy in GitLab dedicated. One, because we don't need that complexity. And with GitLab dedicated, it seems like we're going to be using a single Kubernetes cluster. So we don't need a multi-cluster routing service outside of Kubernetes, for example. So yeah.
Okay, so like just kind of to clarify, like my understanding, so it's pretty much like we have customers on dedicated, they're fine. So if a customer from GitLab.com ends up, I mean, it doesn't matter. Like they don't care what anything looks like under the hood.
Exactly.
As long as they're able to run GitLab.com, they're happy. So we can assume that a smaller instance.
Yeah, and that's
fine.
that's one of the benefits of us using the same tool, right? Like if one of our customer on GitLab.com is not like something is not scaling, if we contribute back to the GitLab dedicated tooling, it's not just fixing the problem for us only, it's also fixing the problem for the GitLab dedicated folks as well in the future, right? So we get to combine kind of forces in that sense, rather than right now, for example, routing, like for example, GitLab.com is using HA proxy, but and we were talking about Istio, but dedicated is still using the ingress controller. So like we have 3 different kind of routing layers at GitLab. So they're all achieving the same thing. So why not try and combine that and maybe figure out if we can improve that in a single technology.
Thank you.
Scarbeck.
Before we move on to my next point, something that might be wise is you called out the GitLab dedicated diff, and this is more related to how infrastructure is running, it's set up, configured, etc. But one thing we probably don't have is like a list of operational tasks and like how those would be managed, and the difference between how they would be managed on cells versus the .com infrastructure today.
Yeah, Nick is working on that, Nick Newen, around operations like security, security feature flags, like for example, Postgres AI, how the engineers get a thing clone of the production database. That's still very much in flight and still a very much work in progress at the moment. So let me try and find the epic for that, but realistically, I'll find it after this meeting because I can't multitask.
I imagine this could be a pretty large document as well, so that'll be fun to read.
Yeah, right now it's still all in epics, reaching out to multiple owners as well.
Gotcha. Okay, cool. So point 4, I was in the AMEA yesterday, which was geared towards the application side of things, and it sounds like there's some technical limitations that we either haven't considered or maybe there just simply hasn't been enough thought to determine whether or not certain things will work appropriately in a cellular architecture. So Pages was one example where it's currently excluded from the version 1.0, the iteration of the cells. And then there was thoughts about CAS, but it sounds like CAS will be fine. But I'm kind of curious as to is there a definition for what we determine what will be allowed to be a global service? And where do we need to start considering how we start to implement various deployment or infrastructure changes to accommodate for this? My concern is that there's a reason why some services may not fully support being able to run in a cellular architecture. And the conversation that I was listening to yesterday was one of them was around the container registry, where they've done a lot of work to deduplicate a lot of the storage to reduce the cost associated with that. And if we turn that service into sell local, we lose a lot of the cost benefit that came from that work. So I'm kind of curious as to what that's going to look like. More future thought, but
Yeah, I mean, picking on the registry itself, I think we all know sales is gonna be more expensive to run. Like, there's no doubt that it's gonna be more expensive to run from like even a machine perspective. We're gonna have more GCP machines physically running, and I think it's like a matter of how efficient we want to be versus how risk averse we want to be, right? Like I see it like if we pack more things into a single machine, the higher the risk, right? Um, so that's how I see it. Now, the efficiency on registry that I still could think that it's still plausible having two registries running parallel. Because as we said, like the largest blobs that comes from our customers, not the base layers. The base layers like Alpine, Ubuntu, yes, we will duplicate those. But is that really 6 petabytes or is that like 20 terabytes, 40 terabytes? Like maybe that's good. Like that's something that cost we can eat up quite easily, for example, right? So regarding Pages, yeah, I think we don't have a criteria of what defines a global service, apart from like, if it doesn't work in SaaS, then it has to be a global service, right? Like another thing that came in this morning is incoming email, like for service desk and things like that. That's probably not going to work as a cellular architecture unless we put in some routing layer on email, which I'm not sure if that's even possible. But we have to figure out how incoming email. So I think the way I'm thinking about it at least, and correct me if you don't think it should be that way, but anything GitLab Omnibus that is managed by GitLab Omnibus is going to be cell related or cell local, unless there's a good reason. But things like the AI gateway, which is deployed outside of Omnibus, because it's going to be like it happens to be under GitLab.com, but it's not part of the GitLab.com Ruby on Rails architecture. It's its own complete service. So that's not going to be part of the cellular architecture at the moment, at least.
thank you, sir.
Devin.
So my question is, you kind of answered a little bit of it with Cameron's question about people being able to spin up their own instances. Once people start doing that, everybody's kind of have their own thing in its own state. Is there a plan to like have a central like single source of truth for what currently works, like we have with staging or something like that?
So maybe I'm not sure I fully understand your question, but the plan is to spin up a QA cell, so we can start doing deployments in that cell. And maybe that's what you mean. Like we're gonna have something production ready where we deploy our code, we run QA, see if it's successful, and it will be start being part of our critical path. But that's still early days. Maybe Alessio can talk more about that, or Scarbeck.
Yeah, that's kind of the
Yeah,
question.
I
Like, where do
can.
we look to see what's currently working before everything is working? Because if we're all trying to come up with, ideas for how to fix things or how to get around stuff that's not working, it would really help to be able to see what the current state is rather than going to all these blueprint documents and hoping that they're up to date.
But are you interested specifically in infrastructure stuff or the code for actually run? So that can the monolith run in cellular architecture? Yes or no? Or can what we have to deploy it today? Those are two
Both
different
actually,
questions.
like,
Okay.
what infrastructure is working, and then once we spin up the infrastructure, what is still broken as far as the code? How do we do like migrations? Like, when do we know whether that problem is solved enough? If we don't have a single source of truth, then there's going to be a lot of people with little pieces of information that we'll have to put together to come up with those answers.
Okay. So first of all, we are trying to define the minimum deployable product, because the point is that even if we had the magic to deploy a cell today, the application does not support it, and so it will be. It makes no sense to rush on the infrastructure if the application can't reach a minimum state of functionality to deploy it, and the other things is true as well, right? So if they can deploy and test it, so what is happening right now is that, for instance, delivery is working on deployment POC, where we are taking the existing dedicated tooling and interaction model that exists and trying to integrate that into the coordinator pipeline or release tools, so that when we do a canary deployment, we are also doing a dedicated tenant. So it's not cell, it's just another instance of GitLab with its own domain that is not connected to anything, that runs the same version. And so we want to see the interface and see how long it takes to do the deployment, if we can trim down the deployment time, see if it's fragile, if it's brittle and old, can we run QA and things like that, right? So we are expecting that by the time that this is ready and other folks in infrastructure onboarded, then we have also maybe a real tenant model that can run in GCP instead of AWS, and we change the tenant model definition so that the next deployment will happen on GCP, and then maybe we have the router and the minimal features needed to actually integrate, and we put those things in front, and so we slowly move towards something that is usable and it produce customer value, because right now we can work independently on our own pressing needs, but then up until we have a stable deployment system that we can all leverage and test things together, is more about testing individually the piece of functionality that we have.
And I think DRIs come into play here as well. Like, for example, the foundation team is the DRI for the architecture, for example, right? Or the tooling we're gonna use. So if anything is broken, ideally we'll have it in an epic somewhere. Like, hey, I don't know, for example, instrumenter is broken for whatever reason. So that would be an issue, and in some epic somewhere, and that would be the single source of truth of like, okay, the foundation needs to fix all these issues before we can start like actually provisioning customer cells. Does that make sense, Devin?
Yeah, it does. Is there any estimate on how long that's going to be? And is it going to be the delivery team letting the rest of us know when there's something usable, or do we have to like kind of keep track of that effort ourselves?
No
that's a
time
multi-
estimate. Go ahead, Oscar.
I was going to say, I think that's a multi-pronged style of question. Like, we in delivery have our OKR to deliver stuff that we need for ourselves for this OKR. So we're creating a POC, which kind of touches and overlaps on a lot of the work that other persons in infrastructure need to consider. So I think ideally, if we complete our POC, we at least have something to showcase, and maybe something we could share and maybe do a demo of along with everyone in the infrastructure who may be interested. But I think Steve, you would probably be the right person to answer as far as like timelines and such.
Yeah, timelines are still a bit wobbly, I think. It's still very early days, and I'm saying very early days, like some people, like for some teams, we're still gathering requirements, what we need. Like for example, on the database level, we still haven't decided like what our goals are to have in the database, or like observability, what kind of observability we're gonna have. So it's still very early days, especially for some teams. Now, if you have to keep in check, or if you're gonna hear somewhere that we need to start provisioning, I think it's more the latter. Like we're gonna say, hey, I think we're like, for example, the foundation team says, hey, I think we're ready to start provisioning our first customer cell, and then that's where like hopefully during that time the ops team has already been onboarded with GitLab Dedicated, and that's when the collaboration starts happening between the ops team and the foundation team to actually start provisioning, right? Because like the foundation first needs to figure out, okay, what to actually provision, and then the ops team does the actual provisioning.
Yeah, I think that answers my question. Thank you.
I'd like to get to chime in and give some clarity to the team too. So on the scheduling overall, I would like it to have our TPM lead, Ethan, help facilitate. We had a meeting yesterday. You know, Andrew was there, Ethan was there, other folks were there with York, and they're trying to figure out the dependencies, how we can untangle things and then parallelize things. And the goal of that is we already have cells 1.0 at feature complete, right? So what else can we parallelize in addition to that, so for us to hit those dates? So please work with your managers to make sure the schedule is clear, and then we will plan a more broader communication when we hit a certain milestone, say when things are ready in delivery or in other things, and other folks should hear from us broadly.
And I added a link to the schedule that Mac is talking about, because it's right now in a Google Sheet, and there's a Gantt chart like with dependencies as well. And speaking of dependencies, there's also, if you look at the pre-read, there's dependencies between the large domains like provisioning, routing, configuration layer, and so on and so forth. That will help you understand some of the dependencies and where your team sits and what depends on. Cameron, I think you have the next item.
All right. So
yeah.
I don't expect to get a definitive answer on like a time. Like I know that the schedule is not going to allow that, but when are we going to turn off GitLab.com? Or do we think we'll try to find a path to migrate it? Or do we think that we'll migrate everyone out of it and then eventually turn it off? Like, what do we think will happen?
I mean, the goal, like the moonshot, is to turn GitLab.com off at some point, but honestly, it's not gonna happen in the next 2 years, right? Like Cell 1.0 is still looking at the schedule, it's still looking late this year, and that's just 1.0, and that is with big product features disabled, right? So whenever we want to move to Cell 1.5 and Cell 2.0, I think that's far ahead, and like I don't think it makes sense to set some time estimates or like some timeline on that, just because it's too early to tell.
Well, I kind of bring this up too because you know, the time frame from when we moved from Azure to GCP, you know, we were in GCP and everyone thought we were done, but we still had lots of services over in Azure. It took us a long time to move. And during that time, you know, in that case, we didn't really have a drastically different deploy process or anything between the two. They were still fundamentally kind of architecturally similar. This is like very different. And we're going to have to maintain, as long as the GitLab.com is up, this parallel method of both deploy and management, as well as sets of infrastructure knowledge and understanding on how things work. So we don't have to answer that in this call. I'm raising it as more like a concern, and I just hope that we do come up with a plan to aggressively keep things simple. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, that's something that's called out in the schedule to keep the configuration in sync between dedicated and GitLab.com. And that could be like, for example, something that the foundation team is doing. So right now, this quarter, the foundation team is working on extracting the web rules into its own Terraform module, like talking implementation details, into its own Terraform module. So dedicated can use it, and that will bring a single source of truth, right? Like the web rules in a single place where everything uses it, and GitLab.com starts using it. So we could start thinking about more things like that in the future as well.
I think our plans to eventually move GitLab.com to cells.
Yes,
So
but
that is
yeah.
so we do it, gradually. So
I think that we're at time. Byron, is your question answered? Is Byron still? Yes, Byron still here.
Yeah, at least SAP we are not going to use, which is good to know. Just a couple questions, like should we be planning to use Ansible for some of this configuration, just like dedicated?
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, it really depends case by case basis, but like if Ansible is used on dedicated, ideally we use that tooling, not to introduce more tooling and the stack, just to keep it simple.
Okay. Yeah. And one last quick question about PG bouncer or any connection pool or anything we have thought about in terms of like.
That's there's a blueprint being worked on by Alex and I on how the databases are gonna work and what tech we're gonna use for that. So yeah, I can try and find the link to link you to it on what Alex is working on.
Yeah, I'm aware of it. Okay, well, sounds good. Thank you.
Awesome. I think we're at time over time. So thank you so much. Hopefully this was useful to you all. If you have more questions, feel free to ask and let me know if something like this should be set up in the future again. Have a nice day, everyone.